He was just digging in his backyard expecting nothing unusual. But beneath the ground, he uncovered a secret hatch that was never mentioned in any house records. When he went down, he was shocked by what he saw. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. For more than a decade, the house had stood for him as a quiet confirmation that life, after all its detours, could settle into something stable and predictable. It was not a large house, nor an especially remarkable one. A modest wooden structure set back from the road, surrounded by a stretch of land that had once been pasture but had slowly been reshaped into a personal refuge. Trees marked the boundary like silent sentinels, and the soil itself seemed cooperative, dark and rich, yielding easily to careful hands. He had chosen this place precisely because it promised nothing extraordinary. After years of noise, uncertainty, and constant adaptation, he wanted a space that asked little of him and offered even less in return. Working in the garden had become his ritual. It was not simply a hobby or a way to improve the appearance of the property, but a deliberate act of grounding himself in something tangible and honest. The earth responded to effort without deception. Seeds either took root or they did not. Weeds returned when neglected. Progress was visible, slow and earned. In the early mornings or late afternoons, when the air cooled and the sounds of the road faded, he could lose himself in the rhythm of digging, clearing, and planting. It was during these hours that the house felt most complete, as if the land itself acknowledged his presence and accepted him as its caretaker. The decision to redesign a portion of the backyard came without urgency. He had been planning it for months, sketching rough layouts in his mind rather than on paper, imagining rows of vegetables and a narrow stone path that would cut through the greenery. It was meant to be a small expansion, nothing ambitious. A practical garden, closer to the house, easier to maintain. On that morning, the sky was overcast, the light muted and even, perfect for working outdoors without the burden of heat. The ground was slightly damp from rain the night before, soft enough to dig without resistance. He worked methodically, clearing the surface first, removing grass and roots, setting them aside in neat piles. His movements were practiced, almost meditative. The shovel slid into the soil with a familiar resistance, the sound of metal against earth dull and expected. Each scoop revealed the same dark, fertile ground, broken occasionally by small stones or tangled roots. Nothing suggested that this patch of land differed in any meaningful way from the rest of the property. Then the sound changed. It was subtle at first, a sharper vibration traveling up through the handle of the shovel rather than the usual muffled thud. He paused, adjusted his grip, and struck again, assuming he had hit a larger rock. The sound returned, unmistakably metallic, echoing faintly beneath the surface. He froze, the shovel still embedded in the ground, his senses sharpening. The land, which had always responded predictably, had just contradicted him. He knelt and brushed away the loose soil with his hands, exposing a smooth, curved edge beneath the dirt. It was not stone. The surface was cold to the touch, unnaturally smooth, and clearly manufactured. As he cleared more earth away, the shape became defined, forming a circular outline set flush with the surrounding ground. The object had been deliberately concealed, covered carefully with soil and grass, its presence erased so completely that even years of living and working on the property had given him no hint of what lay beneath. A strange unease settled over him as he continued to uncover it. The metal was thick, coated with a dark, weathered finish that showed no significant rust despite its apparent age. There were no visible hinges or handles at first, only a perfectly fitted disc embedded in the earth. Whoever had placed it there had not done so casually. This was not debris, nor an abandoned utility fixture. It was intentional, precise, and meant to remain unseen. As more of the surrounding soil was removed, a recessed ring became visible near the edge. He hesitated before touching it, aware of how irrational the moment felt. It was, after all, just an object in the ground. And yet, the longer he stared at it, the more it disrupted his sense of familiarity with the land. The backyard, which had always felt open and known, now seemed layered, as if a hidden version of the property existed beneath his feet, one he had never been invited to see. He sat back on his heels, breathing slowly, listening to the ambient sounds around him. Birds moved through the trees, the wind shifted the leaves, and somewhere in the distance a car passed along the road. Everything above ground remained unchanged. It was only beneath the surface that something had gone wrong. The realization that followed was quiet but profound. If this object had always been there, then his understanding of the house was incomplete. He had trusted documents, inspections, and time itself to reveal all that mattered. Yet, here was proof that something significant had been omitted, either intentionally or through a chain of ignorance that stretched back before his ownership. The thought unsettled him more than the discovery itself. He stood and walked slowly around the site, examining the ground from different angles, as if perspective alone might explain the anomaly. The area showed no signs of disturbance beyond his own digging. Grass grew evenly around the perimeter. There were no depressions, no discolorations, nothing that suggested a structure lay just inches below the surface. The concealment had been thorough, almost elegant in its simplicity. Curiosity pressed against caution. He considered leaving it as it was, covering it back up, returning the land to its former appearance. But the idea felt dishonest, even cowardly. The ground had already spoken. Ignoring it would not restore the certainty he had lost. Whatever lay beneath that metal surface was already part of his life now, whether he chose to acknowledge it or not. He reached down and grasped the metal ring. It was heavier than he expected, resisting his pull at first. With a firm grip and a careful shift of weight, he lifted. The ring moved, breaking a seal that released a faint, stale breath of air from below. The sound was soft, almost a sigh, but it sent a chill through him. The disc rose slowly, revealing a dark opening beneath. He stepped back instinctively, peering into the void. The opening was narrow but deep, its edges lined with reinforced metal. A ladder descended into darkness, its rungs disappearing beyond the reach of daylight. The air rising from below was cool and dry, carrying no scent of decay, only the unmistakable absence of freshness. This space had been closed for a long time, sealed away from the world above. Standing there, with the open hatch at his feet, he felt a subtle shift within himself. The garden, the house, the land, all of it now seemed provisional, as if built atop a story that had never been finished. The discovery did not bring excitement so much as a quiet dread, the sense that he had crossed an invisible threshold simply by uncovering what was meant to stay hidden. He knew even then that this was not the kind of secret that could be ignored or easily explained away. The ground had kept it faithfully for years, perhaps decades. Now that it had been exposed, it demanded attention, understanding, and eventually a choice. As he stood at the edge of the opening, the light behind him and the darkness below, he sensed that whatever waited beneath the house would change the way he understood not only the place he lived, but the lives that had come before his own. And with that realization, the first certainty settled in his mind. The garden he had planned would have to wait. The land had something else to show him first. The open hatch remained where he had left it, a dark, circular interruption in the familiar geometry of the backyard. He had covered it temporarily with a sheet of plywood before nightfall, not to hide it from himself, but to prevent the intrusion of rain, animals, or chance. Sleep came slowly that night. The image of the ladder descending into darkness returned each time he closed his eyes, accompanied by the unsettling thought that the ground beneath his home was no longer solid in the way he had believed. It was layered, hollowed, altered by hands that had worked with purpose and secrecy. By morning, hesitation had given way to resolve. Ignoring the discovery felt impossible. The opening had already shifted something fundamental in him, replacing comfort with a quiet insistence that demanded to be answered. After breakfast, he gathered what he thought he might need: a powerful flashlight, work gloves, a rope, and a small tool bag. The preparation was careful but restrained, driven less by a sense of adventure than by a need to maintain control over a situation that threatened to slip beyond it. Before removing the plywood, he stood for a long moment at the edge of the garden, observing the yard as if seeing it for the first time. In daylight, the place looked unchanged. The trees swayed gently, the soil lay dark and forgiving, and the house stood behind him with its windows reflecting the pale sky. Nothing in the scene hinted at what lay below. That contrast only sharpened his awareness of how thoroughly the hidden structure had been erased from the surface world. He knelt and lifted the covering. The hatch appeared exactly as before, its metal surface dull and unremarkable, the recessed ring resting flush against it. He pulled it open again, and the same cool air rose from below, steady and unchanged, as though the space beneath had been waiting patiently for his return. The ladder glinted faintly in the beam of sunlight that reached just far enough to touch its upper rungs. He tested the ladder first, pressing down with his foot, listening for any protest from the metal. It held firm. The construction was solid, far more so than he had expected. Each rung was anchored into reinforced walls, spaced evenly, free of corrosion. The realization that this structure had been built to last unsettled him more than its mere existence. This was not temporary, not improvised. It was intended for use, perhaps for years. As he began his descent, the sounds of the surface faded with each step. The light narrowed, shrinking into a pale circle above him, while the darkness below thickened. The ladder extended deeper than he had anticipated, forcing him to adjust his grip and pace. With every rung, the air grew cooler, drier, carrying a faint mineral scent that spoke of sealed spaces and long confinement. His breathing sounded louder to his own ears, amplified by the enclosed shaft. Halfway down, he paused. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing smooth, reinforced walls that bore no cracks or signs of collapse. The workmanship was meticulous. There were no loose wires, no exposed pipes, no rough edges. Everything had been planned, measured, and executed with precision. This was not the kind of structure built in haste or desperation. It was the product of foresight and resources. Continuing downward, he became aware of a subtle pressure in his ears, the kind that accompanied a change in depth or environment. The ladder finally ended at a narrow landing, opening into a horizontal tunnel that extended beyond the reach of his light. He stepped off carefully, turning slowly to take in his surroundings. The tunnel walls were curved, reinforced with thick concrete and steel supports set at regular intervals. The floor was level and clean, free of debris, as though it had been sealed shortly after completion. The silence was complete. Not the silence of abandonment, but of isolation. No dripping water, no scurrying animals, no distant echoes of movement. The space felt preserved, suspended in time. His footsteps sounded unnatural here, an intrusion into an environment that had not been meant for casual discovery. He moved forward cautiously, illuminating the tunnel inch by inch. After several yards, the passage widened slightly, and he noticed ventilation grates embedded along the ceiling. They were closed but intact, their filters still in place. This was not merely an underground passage. It was part of a system designed to sustain life. The deeper he went, the more the initial shock of discovery gave way to a growing sense of scale. This was no hidden cellar or forgotten storage space. The tunnel had been engineered to connect to something larger, something deliberate. The thought tightened his chest. Whatever lay ahead was not accidental, and its purpose had been carefully concealed. Eventually, the tunnel ended at a reinforced door set into the wall. It was thick, industrial, fitted with heavy locking mechanisms that showed no signs of tampering. The surface bore faint markings, worn but still visible, suggesting a manufacturer or construction firm, though the name meant nothing to him. He ran his gloved hand across the metal, feeling its cold solidity. The door did not yield when he tested it. It was sealed, and had likely remained so for many years. Standing before it, he felt the weight of the moment press down on him. He had confirmed what the hatch had only implied. Beneath his house lay a structure built for secrecy, endurance, and isolation. And yet, for all its strength and permanence, it had been hidden so completely that even official records had failed to capture its existence. Reluctantly, he turned back. The descent had answered some questions, but raised far more. Climbing the ladder felt different from going down. The space seemed tighter now, the distance longer. When he emerged into the daylight, the brightness felt almost harsh, as though the world above had grown unfamiliar in his brief absence. He replaced the plywood and sat back on the grass, letting the reality of what he had seen settle in. The discovery no longer felt abstract. It was tangible, confirmed by reinforced walls, sealed doors, and the unmistakable intent of its design. This was no longer just his secret. It was something that demanded explanation, context, and understanding. He knew he could not pursue this alone. The implications reached beyond curiosity into questions of legality, safety, and history. The structure had been built without record, hidden beneath property lines that had changed hands more than once. Whatever lay behind that door belonged not only to the past, but now, unavoidably, to the present. As the house came back into view, solid and familiar above the ground, he understood that the descent had marked a turning point. He had crossed from discovery into involvement. The next steps would require more than courage. They would require answers, and answers meant looking outward, beyond the land and into the lives that had shaped it long before he arrived. The way down had shown him what existed beneath the surface. What followed would determine what that hidden world truly meant. The hours after his descent passed in a strange suspension, as though time itself had slowed to accommodate the weight of what he now knew. The reinforced door at the end of the tunnel lingered in his thoughts with an insistence that made it difficult to focus on ordinary tasks. The house above ground felt unchanged in form, yet altered in meaning. Walls that had once represented shelter now seemed to rest upon an unanswered question. Floors he had walked across thousands of times were suddenly revealed as a thin boundary between his daily life and a hidden architecture of secrecy. When his wife returned home that evening, He watched her move through the house with the same familiarity he had always known, and, for a moment, he hesitated. The knowledge he carried felt heavy, almost intrusive, as though sharing it would fracture the calm they had built together. Yet silence was no longer an option. The discovery was not merely physical. It had already begun to reshape his understanding of their home and, by extension, their shared life within it. He led her into the backyard as the light faded, lifting the plywood and revealing the metal hatch beneath. Her reaction mirrored his own first response, a quiet disbelief followed by a careful, almost reverent examination of the concealed entrance. Together they stood at the edge, peering down into the darkness, the beam of a flashlight cutting a narrow path into the unknown. She listened as he described the ladder, the tunnel, the reinforced door, each detail grounding the impossible in tangible reality. The next day, they began the process of verification, driven by a mutual need to understand whether this discovery could be explained through ordinary means. They spread documents across the kitchen table: inspection reports, blueprints, property deeds, renovation permits, all meticulously filed and preserved over the years. Page after page confirmed the same unsettling truth. There was no mention of underground structures, no addendums, no annotations that hinted at anything beyond a standard foundation and utility layout. They expanded their search beyond their own records, accessing municipal archives, zoning maps, and historical planning documents. The process was slow and methodical, requiring patience and persistence. Each record they reviewed reinforced the same conclusion. According to every official source, the structure beneath their home did not exist. This absence troubled them more deeply than the discovery itself. An unrecorded structure of such scale and complexity suggested deliberate concealment rather than oversight. The reinforced walls, the ventilation system, the sealed door all pointed to a project that required significant expertise, materials, and funding. It could not have been built quietly by an amateur or hidden accidentally through bureaucratic error. Someone had ensured that it remained invisible to institutions designed to document precisely such things. They returned to the tunnel together several days later, this time with a clearer purpose. Moving beyond the initial shock allowed them to observe details with greater clarity. The craftsmanship became more apparent the longer they studied it. The curvature of the walls was precise, designed to distribute pressure evenly. The materials showed little degradation, suggesting careful selection and controlled conditions. Even the placement of the ventilation grates reflected thoughtful engineering rather than improvised necessity. Standing before the sealed door, they felt the same unspoken question settle between them. Whatever lay beyond it had been intentionally isolated, not only from the surface but from history itself. The door represented a boundary between what could be acknowledged and what had been erased. Back in the house, their conversations turned increasingly toward the past. They traced the chain of ownership moving backward through decades of transactions. Most of the names were unremarkable, brief entries marking routine sales. Then they reached a period that stood apart. A single owner had held the property far longer than any other, acquiring it quietly and selling it just as discreetly years later. Records from that time were sparse, offering little beyond dates and legal formalities. The lack of detail became a detail in itself. Wealth often leaves traces, but this owner's presence seemed deliberately muted. There were no recorded renovations, no expansions, no public disputes or community involvement. It was as though the house had existed in a kind of administrative shadow during those years. As they examined photographs and maps from that era, Subtle anomalies emerged. Tree lines appeared slightly altered. The backyard layout seemed marginally different, though nothing obvious explained the presence of an underground entrance. These inconsistencies, small and easily dismissed on their own, accumulated into a quiet pattern of omission. The realization settled gradually, but firmly. The bunker had not been forgotten. It had been hidden. This understanding changed the emotional tone of their investigation. Curiosity gave way to caution. Questions of legality surfaced, followed closely by concerns of safety and responsibility. An undocumented structure beneath their property placed them in an uncertain position, both ethically and practically. They were no longer just homeowners uncovering a strange artifact. They were custodians of something that had been deliberately removed from public knowledge. Yet, even as these concerns grew, another impulse persisted. The structure felt less like a threat than a message left incomplete. Someone had invested immense effort into creating a space meant to endure, then had vanished from its story. The bunker existed in a liminal state, neither active nor destroyed, waiting. Late one evening, as they sat quietly in the living room, the weight of that waiting became clear. The discovery was not content to remain static. Each unanswered question generated another, each silence demanded interpretation. The structure beneath their home was exerting a pull, not through force, but through absence. They understood then that documentation alone would not provide the answers they sought. The bunker's creators had chosen secrecy over record, intent over transparency. To understand it, they would have to step beyond official archives and into the human narratives that had shaped the land. The descent had shown what existed beneath the surface. The absence of records confirmed that this existence had been denied. And somewhere between those two truths lay the reason the structure had been built at all. With that realization, their search shifted in direction. The question was no longer simply what the bunker was, but who had needed it to disappear. Once the absence of records became undeniable, their attention shifted naturally toward the people who had lived on the land before them. If the bunker did not exist on paper, then its story had to survive elsewhere, fragmented and distorted by time, memory, and deliberate silence. The house, which had already lost its innocence, now felt like a witness withholding testimony. Every beam and wall seemed to have outlasted a secret it was never meant to reveal. They began with the most tangible thread available to them: ownership. Property records, though stripped of detail, still carried names, dates, and transfers. Working backward through the chain felt like peeling away layers of a long-settled history. Most owners appeared briefly, holding the house for only a few years before passing it on. These transitions were routine, unremarkable, reflective of ordinary lives moving forward. Then, abruptly, the pattern changed. One name repeated itself across decades, attached to a span of ownership that dwarfed all others. During those years, the house had not changed hands, had not been subdivided, expanded, or significantly altered according to public filings. It had existed in a kind of stasis, anchored to a single individual who appeared in the records only when absolutely necessary. The man's name was uncommon, but not unfamiliar enough to feel fictional. Yet, beyond the formal acknowledgement of ownership, there was very little to find. They searched for him next, expecting at least traces of wealth, influence, or notoriety. Instead, they found a void. There were no prominent news articles, no public interviews, no recorded scandals or accolades. Financial disclosures hinted at considerable resources, but the origin of that wealth remained opaque. Corporate registries showed brief associations with companies that had since dissolved or merged, leaving behind little more than expired filings and disconnected addresses. What unsettled them most was not what they found, but how consistently they did not find anything. Wealth, especially on the scale suggested by the few surviving records, usually leaves residue. Philanthropy, litigation, investments, disputes, architecture, all of these generate documentation. Yet this man seemed to have moved through decades without leaving a public shadow proportional to his means. It was as if he had learned early how to exist just beyond the reach of attention. As they dug deeper, they turned to local history. Small towns remember their own, even when official records fall silent. Old zoning boards, neighborhood associations, and long-retired clerks carried fragments of memory that never reached formal archives. Conversations with elderly residents revealed a vague but persistent image of the former owner. He was remembered as quiet, reserved, and intensely private. He rarely attended gatherings, rarely spoke at meetings, and rarely allowed anyone beyond the threshold of the house. Despite his wealth, there was no display of excess. No grand renovations, no lavish landscaping, no visible staff. The house, according to those who remembered it, had looked much as it did now, modest and deliberately unremarkable. This choice, repeated over decades, suggested intent rather than indifference. He had not wanted attention, even from his neighbors. Stories emerged slowly, cautiously, as though the man's preference for secrecy had extended beyond his lifetime. Some recalled brief encounters, distant nods, polite but firm boundaries. Others remembered rumors that never solidified into fact. Whispers of advanced construction equipment arriving at odd hours. Mentions of contractors who came and went without explanation. These recollections were inconsistent and unverified, but they shared a common thread. Something had been built, and it had been done quietly. The name of a private construction company surfaced more than once, spoken hesitantly, as if invoking it invited scrutiny. When they searched for it, they found that the company no longer existed. Its dissolution had occurred years earlier, with little commentary. What remained were fragments: an outdated website preserved in archives, a handful of business registrations, and a reputation for handling projects that others would not take. The company specialized in discretion. That much was clear. Their promotional language emphasized privacy, security, and confidentiality, offering bespoke solutions to clients with specific needs and sufficient resources. Many of their projects were undocumented by design, executed under layers of legal complexity that blurred jurisdiction and accountability. They operated in the margins, where wealth and fear intersected. The connection felt undeniable. The markings on the reinforced door, barely visible but distinct, matched the company's insignia. This was not coincidence. The bunker beneath their home had been built by professionals accustomed to secrecy, commissioned by someone who valued invisibility above recognition. As they pieced together these connections, a clearer portrait of the former owner began to emerge. He was not eccentric in the theatrical sense. There were no dramatic gestures, no public declarations of paranoia or obsession. His eccentricity lay in restraint, in the deliberate narrowing of his world. He had chosen absence as a form of control. The timeline revealed another shift, one more subtle but equally significant. At a certain point during his ownership, his public presence diminished further. Business associations ended. Property transactions ceased. Travel records became scarce. The man did not vanish entirely, but he retreated to the point where his existence became almost theoretical. This withdrawal coincided roughly with the period during which the bunker was likely constructed. The implication was unavoidable. The bunker had not been an afterthought or a contingency plan. It had been a response. Something in the man's life had changed, pushing him toward isolation, secrecy, and preparation. The underground structure was not simply a physical refuge. It was an extension of a psychological shift, a boundary drawn between himself and a world he no longer trusted. As this understanding took shape, their perception of the bunker evolved. It was no longer just an architectural anomaly or a legal complication. It was the residue of a decision made under pressure, guided by fear, grief, or both. The reinforced walls and sealed doors now felt less like defenses against an abstract catastrophe and more like barriers erected against human vulnerability. This realization introduced a new tension into their investigation. The former owner was no longer a faceless name tied to a mysterious structure. He was becoming a person, shaped by circumstances they could only partially reconstruct. His choices, however extreme, began to feel rooted in something deeply personal. Yet sympathy did not erase responsibility. The bunker existed beneath their home now, regardless of the reasons for its creation. Its secrecy had outlived its creator, passing silently into the hands of people who had never consented to its presence. Understanding the past did not resolve the present, but it did complicate it. As they gathered the last fragments of information available to them, one truth stood out with clarity. The bunker was not an act of madness or whim. It was the product of wealth, intention, and a profound desire to withdraw from the world without being pursued by it. The question that lingered was no longer who had built it or how. It was why a man with everything had felt compelled to disappear beneath his own home, and what that disappearance had left behind. With that question unanswered, they knew the investigation had reached a critical threshold. The next step would not lie in records or recollections, but within the structure itself. Whatever had driven the former owner underground had been preserved there, waiting to be understood. After the fragments of the former owner's life had taken shape, the bunker itself no longer felt like an abstract mystery. It became the only remaining witness capable of telling the rest of the story. Records had failed, memories had blurred, and speculation had reached its limits. Whatever truth remained was sealed behind reinforced walls beneath their home, preserved not in words, but in objects, spaces, and deliberate choices frozen in place. They did not rush their return underground. The decision to explore further carried a different weight now. Before, curiosity had driven them forward. Now it was responsibility. The bunker was no longer just a strange discovery. It was a remnant of a human life that had ended in silence. Entering it felt less like trespassing and more like crossing into a private archive never meant to be opened. Preparation became more deliberate. Lighting was improved, equipment checked and rechecked. The descent felt familiar by now, yet it carried a heavier emotional gravity. The ladder led them once again into the cool, controlled stillness of the tunnel, where the air remained unchanged, as though time itself had been filtered and slowed. Each step downward reinforced the sense that this place existed outside the natural rhythms of the world above. Reaching the reinforced door, they paused. It no longer represented mere obstruction, but separation. On one side lay the present, uncertain and unresolved. On the other lay the concentrated residue of a man's decisions. Opening it would collapse that distance forever. When they finally managed to bypass the locking mechanism using careful, methodical effort, the door yielded with a muted resistance, swinging inward as if reluctant to break its long vigil. The space beyond revealed itself gradually under the sweep of their lights. The bunker opened into a central chamber larger than either of them had anticipated. The ceiling arched slightly, reinforced with steel ribs that curved seamlessly into the walls. The floor was smooth, clean, and remarkably intact. There was no sign of collapse, no encroaching moisture, no decay. The environment had been engineered for permanence. From the central chamber, several corridors branched outward, each leading to a distinct area. The layout was intentional, efficient, and unmistakably residential. This was not merely a shelter meant to be occupied briefly. It was designed for sustained living, perhaps indefinitely. The realization altered the tone of their exploration. They were not walking through storage space or emergency infrastructure. They were entering someone's constructed world. One corridor led to a living area furnished with restraint and care. The furniture was functional rather than luxurious, chosen for durability and comfort rather than display. Chairs were positioned deliberately, a table set near a wall where light fixtures had been installed to simulate a consistent day-night cycle. Shelving lined the walls, holding books arranged not by size or appearance, but by subject and frequency of use. Many bore signs of wear, their spines creased and pages marked, suggesting repeated reading over long periods of isolation. Another corridor opened into sleeping quarters. The bed was neatly made, the linens preserved by the controlled environment. Personal items rested on a small table nearby. A watch, a pair of glasses, a notebook closed carefully, as though its owner expected to return. The absence of dust was striking. This was not abandonment in haste. Everything suggested a planned withdrawal, executed with precision and calm. Storage rooms revealed the extent of preparation. Shelves held preserved food, medical supplies, water filtration systems, and replacement parts for equipment. Everything was labeled, cataloged, and organized with meticulous attention. Dates were marked clearly, not just for consumption, but for inspection and rotation. This was the work of someone who anticipated time as both an ally and an enemy. Alongside the practical supplies were items of obvious value. Currency from multiple countries was stored carefully, protected against moisture and decay. Gold bars rested in secure containers, their surfaces dull but unmistakably significant. Yet, even these symbols of wealth felt secondary within the space. They were not displayed or emphasized. They were simply present, treated as another form of insurance rather than the center of the bunker's purpose. More revealing were the personal objects scattered throughout the rooms. Framed photographs stood on shelves and desks, showing moments of a life that had once extended far beyond these walls. Faces smiled from another time, another place. Some images were formal, others candid, but all shared the same quiet distance, as though captured just before something irrevocable shifted. Clothing hung neatly in storage compartments, chosen for comfort rather than fashion, suggesting long-term practicality over outward identity. The deeper they explored, the clearer the psychological portrait became. This was not the bunker of a man preparing for a specific disaster. There were no alarms tied to geopolitical threats, no indicators of imminent catastrophe. Instead, the space reflected preparation for withdrawal itself. The systems were designed to minimize dependence on the outside world, to create an environment where time could pass unnoticed, measured only by routine rather than events. One area in particular underscored this intention. A small room contained items that served no survival function at all. Musical instruments rested against the wall, carefully maintained. Art supplies were organized neatly, untouched but ready. There were journals stacked in chronological order, each one filled to the end before the next began. This was a space for reflection, expression, and preservation of self in the absence of society. The bunker was not cold in spirit despite its concrete and steel. It was deeply human. Every decision embedded in its structure reflected a desire to maintain normalcy, to recreate fragments of life that had become inaccessible above ground. Meals, sleep, reading, creativity, all had been accounted for. The bunker was not meant to protect a body alone, it was meant to preserve a mind. Yet, alongside this careful curation lay an unmistakable loneliness. The rooms were sized for one. Chairs were singular, not paired. The sleeping area accommodated no companion. The table bore marks of use from one place only. Everything in the bunker confirmed what records had only hinted at. This was a world built for solitude. As they moved through the final rooms, they encountered the subtle signs of long habitation. Worn paths along the floor where footsteps had passed repeatedly. Slight indentations in seating where weight had settled over time. These were not relics of brief occupancy. They were the traces of years spent below ground, of days structured entirely within these walls. The bunker told a story without words. It spoke of control achieved through withdrawal, of fear managed by isolation, of wealth transformed into self-sufficiency rather than power. The former owner had not been hiding from a singular threat. He had been hiding from unpredictability itself. Standing once more in the central chamber, they felt the cumulative weight of what they had seen. The bunker was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a confession, preserved in concrete and steel. The man who built it had not sought survival alone. He had sought distance, silence, and the ability to exist without interference. As they prepared to leave the underground world, one understanding settled between them with quiet certainty. The bunker was not an escape from death or disaster. It was an escape from life as it had become unbearable to him. And whatever had driven that choice was still embedded in the walls, waiting to be uncovered in the traces he had left behind. The structure beneath their home had revealed itself as a complete and deliberate world, shaped by one man's refusal to remain exposed. To understand why he had chosen such isolation, they would have to look beyond the space itself and into the moment that had made withdrawal feel like the only possible answer. The bunker had revealed how the former owner lived beneath the surface, but it had not yet explained why he had chosen to vanish into it. That question lingered with a quiet persistence, following them back up the ladder and into the house above. The underground world now felt complete in form, but unfinished in meaning, like a carefully written book missing its final pages. To understand the bunker fully, they would have to trace a moment when withdrawal stopped being an option and became a necessity. Their attention returned to the personal items they had seen below, particularly the journals and documents arranged with such precision. These were not random possessions, they were records. The former owner had preserved his thoughts as carefully as he had preserved his supplies, as if he feared not only the loss of life, but the erasure of memory. Bringing the journals into the light felt intrusive, yet unavoidable. The bunker itself had already crossed that boundary by being discovered. They approached the writings slowly, reading them in sequence rather than sampling them at random. The early entries were measured and analytical, written in a tone that suggested discipline and control. The man described his routines, his observations of the world above, and his gradual disengagement from public life. There was no hysteria, no dramatic declarations of fear. Instead, there was an increasing emphasis on predictability, safety, and autonomy. He wrote as someone attempting to impose order on a world he no longer trusted to behave consistently. As the entries progressed, a shift became apparent. The language grew more personal, less abstract. References to external events faded, replaced by reflections on loss, regret, and exhaustion. Names appeared, then disappeared again, as though he struggled to decide whether to acknowledge them. The careful balance he had maintained between observation and emotion began to fracture. Eventually, the cause of that fracture emerged with painful clarity. The journals revealed a profound personal loss, one that had reshaped his perception of the world entirely. The departure of his wife marked a definitive turning point. Whether through death or irrevocable separation, the result was the same. The relationship that had anchored him to ordinary life had ended, leaving behind a sense of exposure he could not tolerate. The entries following this event were markedly different. The man wrote of vulnerability with an honesty absent from earlier pages. He described the outside world as chaotic, invasive, and indifferent to individual suffering. Where he had once engaged with society selectively, he now perceived it as a source of constant threat. The unpredictability of human connection, which had once given his life meaning, now appeared to him as an unacceptable risk. It became clear that the bunker was conceived not as a response to a single fear, but as a comprehensive solution to emotional uncertainty. He did not trust institutions to protect him, nor relationships to endure. Wealth, which had once provided leverage and security, now felt insufficient. The only reliable safeguard, in his view, was total control over his environment. The journals detailed the planning of the bunker with the same methodical precision evident in its construction. Each decision was framed as a logical step toward minimizing exposure. The location beneath his own home was chosen deliberately, merging familiarity with concealment. The lack of official documentation was not an oversight, but a requirement. To exist on record was, in his mind, to invite intrusion. As they read on, they saw how isolation became self-reinforcing. The deeper he withdrew, the more alien the outside world appeared. The bunker was initially imagined as a retreat, a place to recover equilibrium. Over time, it transformed into a permanent residence, the only space where he felt secure enough to exist without vigilance. The journals described days passing unnoticed, marked only by routine and self-imposed structure. Yet the writings also revealed contradictions. Alongside his insistence on isolation, there were moments of longing. He wrote of memories he could not erase, of a life that had once felt open and connected. The bunker protected him from pain, but it also preserved it, trapping him in a controlled environment where nothing changed, including grief. The fear that drove him underground was not of external catastrophe, but of emotional exposure. He had lost something essential, and rather than risk further loss, he chose absence. The bunker was not built to survive the end of the world. It was built to survive the continuation of it. As the entries neared their end, the tone shifted once more. The meticulous structure of his thoughts began to fray. The certainty that had justified his retreat weakened under the weight of prolonged isolation. He questioned his own decisions, not with regret, but with fatigue. The routines that had once provided stability now felt hollow. Control had protected him, but it had also confined him. The final entries did not offer resolution. There was no declaration of intent, no clear account of his last days. The writing simply stopped. Whether he chose to remain underground until the end or eventually abandoned the bunker was left unsaid. What remained was the unmistakable impression of a man who had traded connection for certainty and found that certainty insufficient. Closing the journals, they felt a deep, unsettling empathy. The former owner was no longer a shadowy figure defined by secrecy and wealth. He was a person who had responded to loss by narrowing his world until it became manageable. His disappearance was not a mystery engineered for intrigue, but a quiet withdrawal shaped by fear and sorrow. The bunker, in this light, became a physical manifestation of an emotional decision. Every reinforced wall and sealed door reflected a desire to avoid further pain by eliminating unpredictability. The underground world was not a fortress against disaster, but a cocoon built to insulate a wounded mind. Understanding this did not diminish the gravity of the discovery. If anything, it deepened it. The bunker was not simply an abandoned structure, it was the residue of a life redirected by trauma. Its existence raised questions that extended beyond legality and ownership into the realm of moral responsibility. As they set the journals aside, the final realization settled between them. The bunker had been built to make disappearance possible. And now that it had been found, that disappearance could no longer remain private. Whatever decision they made next would determine whether the former owner's retreat would remain an isolated act of self-preservation or become a story that demanded acknowledgement. With that understanding, they turned toward the final question. Knowing why the man had vanished did not answer what they should do with what he left behind. The responsibility of the present had finally caught up with the choices of the past. The understanding of why the former owner had disappeared did not bring relief. Instead, it shifted the weight of the story forward, placing it squarely on the present. The bunker was no longer an enigma sealed in concrete and steel, nor merely the private refuge of a man shaped by loss. It was now an inheritance of circumstance, one that Jasper and his wife had never asked for, yet could no longer avoid. Knowledge had closed the distance between past and present, and with that closure came responsibility. In the days that followed, the house felt different. Not threatening, but altered in tone, as if it had absorbed the gravity of what lay beneath it. Ordinary routines continued. Meals were prepared, work was done, nights passed as they always had, yet everything now seemed to occur above a silent question. The bunker existed below them not as a hidden anomaly, but as a presence, patient and unresolved. They could feel it in moments of quiet, when the floorboards creaked softly and the house settled around them, resting on a foundation that was no longer purely structural. They spoke often, sometimes at length, sometimes only in fragments of thought exchanged late at night. The questions they faced were not simple ones. Legally, the bunker complicated ownership in ways that were unclear and potentially far-reaching. An undocumented structure of this scale raised immediate concerns. If authorities were notified, investigations would follow. Property lines, permits, zoning violations, and liability would all come into play. The bunker could be declared unsafe, seized, sealed, or dismantled without regard for the story it contained. Yet, silence carried its own weight. Keeping the discovery private felt uncomfortably close to repeating the same act of erasure that had defined the former owner's life. He had chosen secrecy as protection, and that choice had followed him beyond his disappearance. To remain silent now would preserve that secrecy, but at the cost of acknowledging nothing, learning nothing further, and allowing the bunker to remain a buried confession. No one answered. They considered the objects within the bunker, the journals, the personal effects, the carefully arranged remnants of a life narrowed by fear. These were not merely assets or curiosities. They were expressions of a human struggle, preserved with intention. To reduce them to property alone felt inadequate, almost dismissive of the experience that had shaped them. At the same time, they could not ignore their own position. They had not built the bunker, nor had they consented to its presence beneath their home. Whatever meaning it held, it now existed within their legal and physical boundaries. Their safety, their future, and their right to live without unresolved risk mattered as much as honoring the past. The tension between these truths became the center of their deliberation. They explored possibilities carefully, weighing consequences rather than impulses. One path led toward total disclosure, inviting historians, authorities, and perhaps the public into the narrative. That choice promised transparency and resolution, but also the loss of control. The bunker's story would be interpreted, categorized, and possibly distorted by forces beyond their influence. Another path led toward concealment. The bunker could be sealed once more, its contents left undisturbed, its existence known only to them. This option offered safety from external interference, but it felt heavy with implication. It would mean accepting the role of silent guardians of a story they had not lived, choosing containment over acknowledgement. Between these extremes lay a more deliberate choice. They could seek a way to preserve the bunker's history without surrendering it entirely to anonymity or exploitation. This would require patience, careful consultation, and a willingness to engage with legal frameworks while retaining ethical clarity. It would mean treating the bunker not as a secret to be hidden or exposed indiscriminately, but as a human artifact deserving of context and care. As they revisited the bunker one final time, walking slowly through its rooms, this perspective took shape with greater clarity. The space no longer felt oppressive. It felt complete, finished in its purpose. The man who had built it had done what he believed necessary to survive his own grief. The bunker did not ask to be justified or condemned. It simply existed as the result of that decision. Standing in the central chamber, they recognized something essential. The bunker was not theirs to finish. It was theirs to acknowledge. Its story did not require continuation, only recognition. The former owner had withdrawn from the world, but he had left behind a record of that withdrawal, intentionally or not. To deny that record now would be to repeat the isolation he had imposed on himself. Their decision emerged gradually, shaped by reflection rather than urgency. They chose a path that balanced respect with responsibility. The existence of the bunker would not remain buried, but neither would it be sensationalized or stripped of its human context. They would engage professionals who could assess its safety and legality, and historians who could preserve its story with accuracy and restraint. The personal artifacts would be documented carefully, not claimed as trophies or assets, but treated as fragments of a life that deserved understanding rather than judgment. This choice did not resolve everything immediately. There would be challenges, negotiations, and moments of doubt ahead. But it aligned with something deeper than convenience or fear. It acknowledged that the past, even when hidden, carries weight into the present. And those who uncover it become part of its narrative, whether they wish to or not. In making this decision, they felt an unexpected sense of closure. Not for the former owner, whose life had ended on his own terms, but for themselves. They had faced the unknown beneath their home and resisted the impulse to simplify it into something easily dismissed. They had allowed complexity to remain complex. The bunker, once a symbol of retreat, became something else entirely. It became a reminder that fear can shape entire worlds, and that isolation, no matter how carefully constructed, leaves echoes. Those echoes had reached the surface, not as a warning, but as a question. As they returned to the house above, the ground beneath them felt solid once more, not because the bunker no longer existed, but because it had been acknowledged. The secret the land had kept was no longer silent. It had been heard, understood, and placed within the larger, imperfect story of human choice. In the end, the discovery had not been about what lay underground. It had been about what people do when trust collapses, when loss reshapes identity, and when control feels like the only refuge. The bunker was one man's answer to those fears. The response to its discovery became another, and in choosing to face the past rather than bury it again, they accepted a truth as old as the ground itself. Some secrets are not meant to remain hidden forever. They endure only until someone is willing to carry them forward with care. If this story made you think, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. New stories are coming, and some of them go even deeper than this one. Watch the other videos on the channel to uncover more hidden truths, forgotten secrets, and stories that stayed buried for years. And if this video caught your attention, share it with someone who loves mysteries like this. You never know which story will stay with them the longest.